Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. Toward noon, the Soviets began to retaliate and rained a devastating fire on the rising waves of Junge Löwen. But nothing stopped the young lions even for a moment, and the burnt-out ruin of Belgorod fell into the hands of their survivors on the second evening. In a heady state, near delirium, we went on, with almost no rest, to enlarge the wedge our troops had driven into the mass of the Soviet Central Front, a front of 150,000 men, according to our so-called information services. In fact, closer to 400,000 or 500,000 Russians were jostled back by 60,000 Germans. By the evening of the third day of continuous battle, during which we had only been able to snatch an occasional half-hour of sleep, we were seized by the furious strength of madmen. Our group had lost both the Czech and the sergeant, and as they lay either dead or wounded among the ruins, two grenadiers who had lost their units joined us. We were now split into three groups, including the 11th, in which Olensheim was still alive, and the 17th, which had rejoined us, jointly commanded by a lieutenant. We had been ordered to reduce the pockets of resistance in the ashes of a suburb called Deptrioka, if I remember correctly, enclaves which continued to defend themselves, although they had been left behind by the retreating Soviet forces. Our faces, streaked with dust and filth and sweat, stared across the ruined, apocalyptic landscape through which we were advancing, more interested in quiet corners for a few moments of sleep than in Russian strays. Explosions from the forefront of our advance were continuously shaking the air around us and compressing our weakened lungs. No one spoke, except for an occasional halt or Achtung, which threw us down onto the burning ground. We were so exhausted that we stood up only when our fire had subdued the isolated and hopeless resistance from some entrenched hole. Sometimes one or two prisoners might emerge from their hideout with their hands in the air, and each time the same tragedy repeated itself. Kraus killed 4 of them on the lieutenant's orders, the Sudeten 2, Group 17, 9. Young Lindbergh, who had been in a state of panic ever since the beginning of the offensive and who had been either weeping in terror or laughing in hope, took Kraus's machine gun and shoved 2 Bolsheviks into a shell hole. The 2 wretched victims were both a good deal older than the boy and kept imploring his mercy. We could hear their desperate shouts for a long time, but Lindbergh, in a paroxysm of uncontrollable rage, kept firing until they were quiet. Then there was the bread house, so-called because after the massacre we found a few wretched biscuits there, which we devoured, hoping to extract some return for the horrors which the war forced upon us. We were mad with harassment and exhaustion, running on our nerves, which were stretched to the utmost, and which alone made it possible to respond to the endless succession of crises and alerts. We were forbidden to take prisoners until our return trip. We knew that the Russians didn't take any, and although we longed for sleep, we knew that we had to stay awake as long as there were any Bolsheviks in our sector. It was either them or us, which is why my friend Halls and I threw grenades into the bread house at some Russians who were trying to wave a white flag. When we reached the end of our sweep, we collapsed at the bottom of a large crater and stared at each other for a long time in dazed silence. None of us could speak. Our uniforms were unbuttoned, torn, and so permeated with dust they were the color of the ground. The air still roared and shook and smelled of burning. 4 more of our men had been killed, and we were dragging along 5 or 6 wounded, one of them Olensheim. There were about 20 of us huddled in that huge hole, trying to put our thoughts into some kind of order, but our stupefied eyes continued to wander vacantly over the burned landscape, and our heads remained empty. The radio announced that our Belgorod offensive had been crowned with success and marked the beginning of our further progress eastward. By the 4th or 5th evening, we had gone through Belgorod without even knowing it. Our assault troops were catching their breath, and numberless ranks of infantry were sleeping on the great battered plain. We were soon loaded onto a truck and driven to a key position. I didn't understand why the ruined hamlet where we were put down was considered strategic, but grasped that this was one of the places from which the next phase of our offensive would be launched. The gently rolling landscape of fat-bellied orchards and willow-bordered streams and irrigation canals reminded me somehow of Normandy. It was occupied either by lines of defense or by rallying points for our assault troops. We began to organize our position among the poor, half-ruined houses of the hamlet. Our first job was to get rid of some 30 Bolshevik corpses scattered through the rubble. We dumped them into a small garden which must once have been cultivated. The day was hot and heavy. A greasy sun threw sharp shadows and made us squint in the harsh light which emphasized every hollow in our exhausted faces. The same light poured down onto the faces of the dead Russians, whose fixed eyes were opened inordinately wide. Looking at them and thinking about us all made my stomach turn over. "Isn't it funny," the Sudeten remarked calmly, "how quickly a fellow's beard grows when he's dead? Look at this one." He turned over a body with his foot. The man's tunic was torn by 7 or 8 bloody holes. "He probably shaved yesterday just before he was killed. And look at him now. He's got a beard on him that would have taken him at least a week otherwise." "See this one," laughed another fellow, who was clearing out a building which had been hit by a heavy mortar shell. He was dragging a Russian soldier whose head had been blown off. "You'd do better to go and shave yourself if you want anyone to recognize you when it's your turn tomorrow. You give me a pain with your idiotic remarks. Anyone would think that's the first stiff you've ever seen." The veteran sat down on a heap of rubble and opened his mess tin. We found a cellar which made a perfect defense point and moved into it with our 2 machine guns. We dug out the air vent which had been blocked by the collapse of the house and even enlarged it, stopping work for a moment to watch a flight of Stukas pass overhead. Somewhere, not too far away, Ivan must have been drenched by a rain of bombs. Hals had made a hole in the masonry walls and was estimating the firing possibilities. Lindbergh was almost jubilant to be setting up this precarious shelter. Everything which now seemed to be working to our advantage stirred him to a strange excitement, in contrast to the helpless fear in the flaming alleys of Belgorod, which had reduced him to whining and pissing in his pants. 3 yards away, the veteran and I were shoving in supports to brace the enlarged air vent, which, at best, seemed a shaky proposition. Whenever we moved, our helmets scraped against the low ceiling. Behind us, Kraus and 2 other grenadiers were removing the fallen stones and rubble which littered the floor. One of them picked up an empty bottle and, with a civilian reflex, stood it against the wall to wait for the harvest. As I've said, we had lost our non-commissioned officer, and the veteran, who was an Obergefreiter, was now commanding our group. However, we were still under the orders of a fat Stabsfeldwebel, who directed all 3 groups and who was killed 2 days later. The bastard checked our work with all the airs of a superior officer, forcing us to check this detail or that, unaware that he had only 48 hours left. We spent the day waiting and watching companies of sweating troops march by against a continuous background of heavy explosions and a variety of other noises. It was in precisely these moments that everything became intensely painful. As we slowly regained our spirits, we began to grasp what had happened to us. It suddenly struck us that our non-commissioned officer and Grumpers and the Czech and the wounded boy abandoned to his fate were in fact no longer with us. We tried to blot out the memory of the Russian trench we had machine-gunned and the tanks driving heavily over that moving mass of human flesh, and Deptrioka, with its piles of Bolshevik corpses and the hammering of enemy artillery in the narrow streets crammed with Hitler-Jugend, all the appalling, inexplicable details. We suddenly felt gripped by something horrible which made our skins crawl and our hair stand on end. For me, these memories produced a loss of physical sensation, almost as if my personality had split. I knew that I was actually incapable of such experiences, not because I was superior to other people, but because I knew that such things don't happen to young men who have led normal lives more or less like other people's. The 3 grenadiers stood talking beside the staircase. The veteran, alone by the air vent through which floods of sunlight poured into the room, was going through his pockets, spreading out their wretched contents on a flat stone. Hals had curled his big body onto a rough bench and was lying silent, while Lindbergh and the Sudeten were staring through holes in the wall, with their minds clearly far away. I went over to Hals and lay down beside him. We stared at each other for a moment, unable to speak. "What the hell are we doing here?" Hals said finally. His face had grown noticeably harder since Bialystok. I limited myself to a gesture of ignorance. I'd like to sleep, but I can't, he said. Yes, it's just as hot in here as outside. Let's go out anyway. We went out and took a few steps. The light was blinding. Maybe there's some cold water over there, I said, pointing to an orchard divided by a thin stream. I'm not thirsty, not hungry either, Howells answered to my great surprise. I was used to his enormous appetite. Are you sick? No. I just feel like vomiting. I'm so tired. And those fellows over there don't help either. He nodded at the 30 putrefying corpses in the little garden. That's always how it is with fellows who won't make any more trouble, I answered in a tone which still surprises me. Ours were picked up before we got here, Hals continued. There's some freshly turned ground just inside the village. I don't know how many they were able to stuff in there. Do you know how many we've had killed already? We were silent for a moment. We'll probably be relieved soon, Hals. Yes, he said. I hope so. We really were shits to kill those Popovs at the bread house. He was clearly desperately troubled by the same things that troubled me. The bread house is how it is, and all there is, I answered. I could still feel the cartridges running through my hands, see them entering the Spandau, and see the bluish smoking metal of the barrel and the sparks that flew out each time the gun fired, painfully striking my hands and face, and hear the shrieks penetrating the infernal din and the cries for help. Pomoshch! Pomoshch! Something hideous had entered our spirits to remain and haunt us forever. It was broad daylight, but we had no idea what time it was. Was it still morning? Was it afternoon? It didn't matter. Everyone ate and drank when he could, slept when he could, and tried to think whenever he could take off his helmet. It's strange how much a helmet interferes with thought. It was still daylight when an enemy barrage ripped into the orchards and the advancing troops, who had stopped only a short distance from us. We dived into our cellar shelter and stared anxiously at the ceiling, which rained down plaster with each explosion. We'll have to shore it up too, said the veteran. If anything lands too close, the whole thing will come down on our heads. The bombardment lasted for at least 2 hours. A few Soviet shells fell right beside us, but they were clearly intended for the assault troops. Our big guns answered theirs, and all other sounds were drowned in the noise of artillery. Shells from our howitzer were shooting right over our ruin, contributing as much to the collapse of our ceiling as the Russian shells, which sometimes burst less than 30 yards away. During the bombardment, we were all gripped by an extreme and exhausting tension. Some of us attempted predictions only to be contradicted by events a few moments later. The veteran smoked nervously, continuously begging us to shut up. Kraus had drawn apart and sat muttering in a corner. Perhaps he was praying. In the evening, one of the counterattack units visited us and installed an anti-tank gun nearby. A colonel came by a little later and tested the new supports we had put in to prevent any further collapse of the roof. Well done, he said. He made the rounds of our little group, offering each man a cigarette. Then he rejoined his unit, which was part of the Grossdeutschland, a little closer to the front. It grew dark. Through the tattered silhouettes of the remaining orchard trees, the horizon glowed red with fire. The battle was not yet over, and the extreme tension it generated was almost unbearable. We had to take turns standing guard outside, and no one had a good night's sleep. We were rounded up well before dawn and forced to abandon our well-organized hole and proceed further into Soviet territory. The German advance had not been stopped. During our advance, we crossed a frightful slaughtering ground of Hitlerjugend, mixed into the dirt by the bombardment of the day before. Each step made us realize with fresh horror what could become of our miserable flesh. Somebody should have buried all this mincemeat so we wouldn't have to look at it, Hals grumbled. Everyone laughed as if he'd just said something funny. We crossed a piece of ground so heavily pitted with shell holes it was hard to imagine that anyone who'd been on it could have survived, and an open-air hospital behind an embankment from which the shrieks and groans came so thick and fast it sounded like a scalding room for pigs. We were staggered by what we saw. I thought I would faint. Lindbergh was crying with terror. We crossed the enclosure with our eyes fixed on the sky, seeing as if in a dream young men howling with pain, with crushed forearms or gaping abdominal wounds, staring with incomprehension at their own guts, puffing out the piece of cloth which had been hastily flung over them. Immediately beyond the hospital, we had to wade across a canal. The cool water which rose over our waists made us feel much better. On the far bank, the springing turf was strewn with Russian bodies. A Soviet tank, twisted and blackened by fire, stood beside a big gun and the shattered bodies of its operators. To our left, in the northeast, the battle continued more fiercely than ever. We thought we heard a groan from one of the Russian gunners and went over to a man smeared with blood who was leaning, gasping, against one of the wheels of the gun carriage. One of our men uncorked his drinking bottle and lifted the head of the dying man. The Russian stared at us through enormous eyes, widened by terror or shock. He cried out, and then his head fell back, thudding against the metal of the wheel. He was dead. We continued across a series of rolling wooded hills, where our frontline troops were regrouping and catching a moment's rest in the shade of the trees. Many men wore bandages, whose whiteness stood out sharply against their gray, dusty faces. We were rapidly regrouped, called out, and sent to precise locations. The 2 grenadiers who had joined us were sent somewhere else, while our 8th group was completed by a new pair of strays. Unfortunately, the Stabsfeldwebel, whom I've mentioned before, and who had only one more day of life, was made the leader of our group. We were swiftly attached to an armored section which transported us on the backs of their machines to the edge of an enormous plateau which seemed to stretch into infinity. We jumped off the backs of the moving panzers to join a group of soldiers lying flat at the bottom of a shallow trench. Already, several 50-millimeter rounds fired directly at us by enemy artillery had brought it home to us that we were in the front line. The tanks turned back and vanished under the trees some 50 yards behind us. We plunged down beside the fellows who were already there, who seemed none too cheerful. The Russian fire followed the tanks and was lost in the brush. Our idiot Stabsfeldwebel was already feeling uneasy about the distractions of the neighborhood and was discussing them with a very young lieutenant. Then the young officer waved to his men, who followed him toward the woods, running and bent nearly double. The Popovs, who must have been watching, sent over 5 or 6 rounds aimed directly at them. Some of their bullets landed very close to us. Once again, we were alone, 9 of us in a hole, facing the Soviet lines. The sun was directly above us. "Get cracking on that hole now," shouted the Stabs in a perfect parade ground voice. We began to turn over the dusty Ukrainian soil with our short pick spades. We barely had time to speak. The heat of the sun was crushing and increased our lassitude. "We'll probably die of exhaustion before anything else has a chance to get us," Hals said. "I give up." "My head is killing me," I answered with a sigh. But our bastard Stabs kept after us, staring anxiously out over the grassless plain which stretched into the distance as far as the eye could see. We had just finished setting up our 2 Spandaus when the noise of tanks rolling over the brush behind us made us shudder. On that magnificent summer afternoon, German tanks were once again leaving the shade and driving toward the east. From behind them, entire regiments, bent double, passed us and vanished into a wall of dust which hid them from view. About 5 minutes later, the Russians began a bombardment of unprecedented ferocity. Everything became opaque, and the sun vanished from our eyes, which had become enormous with fright. The storm cloud of dust was relieved only by continuous red flashes shooting up against the darker masses of trees 80 or 100 yards away. The earth shook harder than I'd yet felt it do, and the brush behind us burst into flame. Screams of fear froze in our constricted throats. Everything seemed displaced. The air all around us was filled with flying clods, mixed with fragments of metal and fire. Kraus and one of the newcomers were buried in a landslide before they even knew what had happened to them. I threw myself into the deepest corner of our hole and stared uncomprehendingly at the stream of earth flooding towards our shelter. I began to howl like a madman. Hals pressed his filthy head against mine, and our helmets clattered together like 2 mess tins. Hals's face was transfigured by terror. "It's the end," he gasped, his words broken up by the explosions which took away our breath. Overwhelmed by horror, I could only agree. Suddenly, a human figure crashed into our hole. We both trembled with desperation and fright. Then a second human shape joined the first in a great leap. This time our huge eyes took in that these were two of our own men. One of the newcomers shouted to us through his frantic gasps for breath. "My whole company was wiped out. It's terrible." He carefully lifted his head just over the edge of the embankment as a series of explosions began to rip through the air beside us. His helmet and a piece of his head were sent flying, and he fell backward with a horrifying cry. His shattered skull crashed into Hals's hands, and we were splattered with blood and fragments of flesh. Hals threw the revolting cadaver as far as he could and buried his face in the dirt. The explosions had become so violent that we felt the ground all around us must be shifting. Outside our hole on the torn and ravaged plain, we could hear an engine roaring out of control. Then there was another explosion, more violent than all the others, and an enormous flash of light swept the edge of our trench. Our two Spandaus fell back on top of us in a wave of loose earth. Those who weren't struck dumb with fright howled like madmen. "We're finished." "Mama, it's me." "No, no. We'll be buried alive. Help." But nothing we said could put an end to this hell, which seemed to go on forever. About 30 soldiers on the run plunged in with us. We were kicked and shoved without mercy, as everyone tried to burrow down as deeply as possible. Whoever was left on top was finished. The earth all around us was pocked with thousands of shell holes, and from each of these we could hear the sounds of fleeing soldiers looking for refuge. But the cruel Russian soil was torn by fresh salvos, and those who thought they'd been saved continued to die. We heard the roar of airplane engines, and cheers for the Luftwaffe rose from thousands of desperate men. The bombardment continued for a few more seconds, and then decreased dramatically. The officers who were still alive blew their whistles for retreat, and the men packed into our hole poured out like rabbits chased by a ferret. We were about to follow when our Stabsfeldwebel, who hadn't yet been killed, shouted loudly after us, "Not you! We're here to stop a Russian counteroffensive. Get your guns ready to fire." 6 Hitler-Jugend cadavers were lying on the bottom of the trench, which had completely changed shape. To the left, one end was caved in, and Kraus's boots were sticking out of 2 cubic yards of gray dirt. The other grenadier had been completely buried. With the help of the veteran, whose face was streaming with blood, we were able to get the machine gun back into place. The plane, which had been altered beyond recognition, was scarred with holes and lumps, as if giant moles had been at work. Wherever one looked, there were smoke and flame, and a scattering of motionless bodies. In the distance, through spirals of dust and smoke, we could see geysers of fire from the bombs which our Messerschmitt 110s were dropping on the Russian artillery. It looked as though we'd hit a couple of their ammunition dumps. The shock waves from those explosions engulfed the earth and sky in an extraordinary intensity of light and displacement of air. "Those bastards!" shouted the Obergefreiter. "Now they're getting what they deserve." Our Messerschmitt 1-10s turned back to the west, and the Russian artillery opened up again. They were concentrating particularly on the tanks, which were retreating in disorder, with at least half their number destroyed. Although my left arm had almost been broken when the gang of panic-stricken soldiers jumped into the trench on top of us, I had felt nothing at the time. Now it was beginning to cause me violent pain, which hovered beside me like a supplementary presence, but I was too busy to pay much attention to it. The bombardment was continuing to the north and to the south, and then passed over us once again, intensifying and spreading its complement of pain and terror. Our group of stupefied men could breathe only with difficulty, like an invalid who gets up after a long illness to find he has lost both strength and wind. We were all unable to speak. There was nothing to say then about the hours we had just lived through, and there is no way of describing them now with the vehemence and force they require. Nothing remains for those who have survived such an experience but a sense of uncontrollable imbalance and a sharp, sordid anguish which reaches across the years, unblunted and undiminished, even for someone like me who is attempting to translate it into words, although a precise and appropriate vocabulary remains elusive. Abandoned by a god in whom many of us believed, we lay prostrate and dazed in our demi-tomb. That concludes the 19th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.